In the modern world, empire rarely announces itself. It does not always arrive with flags, or colonies, or formal declarations. It often arrives through doctrines, through assumptions so deeply embedded they come to feel natural. In the opening chapters of Hegemony or Survival, Noam Chomsky asks a question that is both historical and existential. Can a global system built on permanent supremacy survive without destroying what it claims to protect? This is not a book about villains, it is a book about structures, about the logic of power, about what happens when one state comes to believe that it must dominate the world in order to remain secure. Chomsky's argument is unsettling, not because it is dramatic, but because it is administrative, because it unfolds through memoranda, planning documents, and institutional habits. What hegemony means. The word hegemony can sound abstract, but Chomsky uses it in a precise sense. Not simply influence, not leadership, not moral authority, but veto power over the international order. A hegemon is not merely the strongest nation, it is the nation that insists no rival system may be allowed to emerge. Not a competing military bloc, not an independent economic sphere, not an alternative model of development. Hegemony, in this sense, is not just dominance. It is the refusal of limits. And Chomsky argues that after World War II, the United States did not stumble into this role. It defined it. It institutionalized it. It made it doctrine. The post-war architecture. One of the most striking features of these early chapters is how familiar the cast of characters becomes. Because the architects of American power were often presented as wise, measured, and reluctant. Statesmen, strategists, managers of order. But Chomsky insists that beneath the language of defense was a clear commitment that the post-war world would be organized in a way that preserved American primacy and prevented serious deviation. This is not a conspiracy. It is written into planning documents, into National Security Council memoranda, into strategic frameworks. From early Cold War planning to what later becomes formalized as national security strategy, the assumption appears repeatedly that global stability depends on American dominance, that rivals must be contained, and that the international system must remain in some ultimate sense under supervision. The point is not that such documents are sinister, the point is that they reveal assumptions. Dominance is treated not as an option, but as necessity. Hegemony was not merely ambition, it was administration, a system designed to manage the world economy, the flow of resources, and the permissible boundaries of sovereignty. And once such a system exists, it demands maintenance. Humanitarian language, imperial practice. Chomsky's most persistent theme is the gap between rhetoric and reality. Power rarely describes itself as power. It describes itself as responsibility, as peacekeeping, as protection, as the defense of freedom. But the instruments are familiar: intervention, coercion, the disciplining of weaker states, the removal of unfriendly governments, the shaping of outcomes from afar. The language remains noble, the practice remains strategic. At times this logic becomes most visible, not in great power rivalry, but in regions deemed peripheral. In much of Latin America during the Cold War, governments that pursued independent economic paths or challenged U.S. strategic priorities were treated not as political variations, but as problems to be managed. The language was stability, the language was security, the language was anti-communism. The reality was intervention, pressure, and the reshaping of outcomes from outside. Not because these societies threatened the United States militarily, but because they challenged the assumption that alternatives were permissible. And Chomsky argues that this is not simply hypocrisy, it is functional. Because in a democratic society, force requires legitimacy, not only abroad but at home. Consent must be cultivated. Narratives must be maintained. The empire must remain unnamed, even as its management becomes permanent. Why survival is literal. Here the argument darkens, because the question is no longer whether hegemony is moral, it is whether it is survivable. The 20th century introduced something unprecedented, a global system of power operating under the shadow of nuclear weapons. In earlier centuries, empires could expand, clash, collapse, and history continued. But in a nuclear world, the margin is thinner. The cost of miscalculation is no longer regional, it is terminal. A doctrine of permanent supremacy produces constant confrontation, constant intervention, constant risk. The hegemon cannot tolerate neutrality, cannot tolerate independence, cannot tolerate rivals, and in doing so, it plays a dangerous game with the conditions of life itself. This is why the title is not metaphorical, it is survival. The security state turns inward. A global doctrine of control does not remain external. The machinery built to manage the world also reshapes society that builds it. Secrecy becomes normal. Surveillance becomes routine. Executive authority expands. The national security state develops its own momentum. Over time, democratic life adapts around it, as if this structure were permanent reality. The techniques developed abroad return home. Emergency becomes habit. Exception becomes the norm. Management becomes legitimacy. And in moments of rupture, from covert interventions to domestic scandals like Watergate, the machinery briefly becomes visible, not as an aberration, but as a system. So these first 6 chapters are not the whole argument. They are the foundation, the doctrine, the architecture. Chomsky is asking us to see global power not as a series of accidents, but as an institutional commitment to prevent alternatives, to manage outcomes, to preserve dominance indefinitely. And the danger he suggests is not only what this does to other nations, but what it does to the world and to the society that carries the burden of supremacy. Because in the nuclear age, and perhaps in the ecological age as well, there may be no safe room for a permanent empire. The question is not whether a state has ideals. The question is whether any state can be entrusted with unlimited power, hegemony, or survival. Thank you for watching. This is part of a longer arc. If you'd like to stay with it, you can subscribe for future chapters. Otherwise, please leave a like.